Alex Gabuev. He is the director of the Carnegie Endowment's Eurasia Center, and he was forced to leave Moscow last year when the Kremlin shut down his office. Alex is following China's relations with Russia and Europe closely, and he joins me now from Berlin. Alex, it's great to see you, my friend. A lot to talk about here, a lot of focus on what's transpiring in the meetings taking place, the high-level meetings in China, we should say. Let's start with French President Macron and his attempt to put more pressure on President Xi to get Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine. Here's what Macron said to Xi that he was counting on him for. He said to bring Russia back to reason and everyone back to the negotiating table on Ukraine. Now, Alex, we have been here before. President Macron tried to play the diplomatic leader here with regards to Vladimir Putin, whether it was on phone calls or in-person meetings in Moscow in the months leading up to the war. That didn't result in anything promising. The war continued. There are a lot of people who are viewing this meeting with the same sense of pessimism. Are you one of those people?
I'm pretty pessimistic on the ability of President Macron to turn China's support for Russia. And at the same time, I think that China believes that it doesn't have enough leverage to bring Putin to a negotiation table if his tunnel vision is really to destroy Ukraine. And at the same time, China doesn't have interest to stop this war and bring Russia to the negotiation table and deliver peace on Ukrainian terms.
That's interesting because a lot of people would say that, oh, China and President Xi just has to snap his fingers and Russia will do whatever he is telling him to do. You're saying that he does not have the leverage that many think that he has over Vladimir Putin to end this war. Why?
His leverage is definitely growing. China now accounts for 30% of Russian exports, 40% of Russian imports, including high-tech goods like chips, are coming from China, and all of the trade increasingly is cleared through Chinese yuan, the Chinese currency. But at the same time, China is fully aware that Russia's dependency on Europe was much bigger before the war started. And needless to say, it was even bigger in 2014 when Russia decided to annex Crimea. And then Putin is so fixated on Ukraine, he believes that bringing Ukraine to its knees and dominating in Ukraine is something that will define his legacy. No matter how much leverage and influence Xi Jinping has over Putin, he doesn't really have the power to push him from these thoughts.
I want to play for our viewers how President Xi responded to these comments from President Macron, specifically with regards to any sort of influence he could have on negotiations between the two countries.
On the matter of Ukraine, China continues to urge for talks to reach a settlement. China is willing to work with France to urge the international community to exercise rational restraint and to avoid worsening the situation, to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control.
He went on to say that China, quote, appeals for the protection of civilians and nuclear weapons must not be used and nuclear war must be avoided. So, Alex, you and I know and our viewers know there's only one party that's threatening the use of nuclear weapons, and there's only one party in this war that's targeting innocent civilians. So what do you make of President Xi's comments here and his quote-unquote commitment, shall we say that, to bring more negotiations about between these two countries?
We've heard these words before from the Chinese leader and from people down below in the Chinese system. They're saying platitudes. Of course, innocent women and children shouldn't be hurt. Of course, peace is better than war. And of course, nuclear weapons shouldn't be used. It's like saying that sky is blue and grass is green. This is also part of what people call China's peace plan that was unveiled a year into the invasion. That's basically a laundry bag of very familiar talking points that we've heard from China. At the same time, there is nothing to suggest that China is really ready to pressure Russia into sitting down for a sincere negotiation with Ukraine. And I think that President Biden got the same wording from Xi Jinping. Before that, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had also Xi Jinping same platitudes. But at the same time, China doesn't show in its behavior that it's ready to use any sort of influence and use any persuasion to make Mr. Putin abandon his current disastrous course.
Yeah, and to that point, China hasn't proven to be an honest broker here. I mean, you had Xi Jinping very publicly make a trip to Moscow, a couple of days he spent there, which was rare for him. And yet he has yet to pick up the phone and call President Zelensky. He says that that may or may not happen in the future. What do you make of that decision?
I think that President Zelensky has some very unpleasant things to say about China's role in keeping the Russian system afloat. China is becoming the major buyer of Russian oil. It's the major supplier of dual-use goods, including chips. We know that Chinese producers are part of Russian military supply chain, including weapons that are used on the battlefields in Ukraine, targeting Ukrainian citizens, killing Ukrainian civilians. And at the same time, China is very slow to roll out its support for Ukraine. It's pledged below $1 million in humanitarian assistance, and yet that's not being delivered. So picking up this phone call and listening to all of this makes Xi Jinping vulnerable. If there is a risk that President Zelensky will disclose the content of negotiation, that's probably not the risk that the Chinese leader wants to take. It could be really embarrassing for him.
So, given these meetings now between European officials and President Xi, you have obviously President Macron there, you have Ursula von der Leyen, you had the German Chancellor visit recently, and you also had the Spanish Prime Minister visit China recently. Xi cannot deliver any sort of sincere pledge to be an honest broker and end this war, but he can't deliver something economically. And that is his real intent here, right? Is to sort of try to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe in terms of their relations economically with China. He's said that he would like to sign a cooperation agreement over aerospace, civil nuclear energy, agriculture, supply chains. That's just for France. Do you see this as an effective strategy on Xi's part?
I think that China is pulping and sensing these divisions in the transatlantic camp. I think that the Inflation Reduction Act and the US push for European economies to decouple from China is creating rifts and discussions within EU. Because if we take France, it was not as dependent on Russia for its energy as Germany, but it still was. And now this Russian pillar of German economic prosperity and European economic prosperity is gone because of sanctions. And then China is a major market for Germany, France, Spain, and other countries. And here Xi Jinping senses a weakness that these leaders need to go to China and need to secure their position in the Chinese market. And they're also in competition. Olaf Scholz went there alone, despite Macron's suggestions to go together. So this competition inside Europe and the rifts in the transatlantic camp is something that Xi is happy to exploit. And if you need to provide diplomatic cover for this, so you go to the leader of the most powerful authoritarian country in the world, you don't do that for petty business of Alstom and other French companies. You do that for the cause of peace in Ukraine. And that's a good lens to frame these trips, even if they are fruitless.
Yeah, because just from the economic perspective, I'm just wondering, can you really decouple the war in Ukraine and whatever leverage that Xi may have over it and economic ties to China? Because if you look historically in the past, the United States does have a point when it says to European countries, you tried to do the same thing with Russia when you depended on Russia for your energy supply and source there. And look how that turned out for you. Could this be a warning, and is Europe not heeding these warnings that perhaps the same thing could come out of their relations with China?
There are multiple discussions around this in corporate boards and in government quarters in Europe. And in various capitals, you have very different schools of thought. Ursula von der Leyen, chairwoman of the European Commission, who travels with President Macron, has just delivered a policy speech on China when she says that decoupling is probably the wrong word, but de-risking and reducing the exposure of the European Union to China and decreasing options for China for its predatory behavior in the European economy and technology sector is very important. But at the same time, President Macron goes and presides over signing of a new Airbus deal that envisages not only sale of 160 jets to China, but also building a new Airbus plant in Tianjin. I think China's economic leverage is much bigger than the one that Russia ever had in Europe. And at the same time, it wants to prevent and preempt this decoupling. It says, we're not Russia, we're not invading anybody. It's the Americans who are pushing you in a wrong direction.